There is a kind of betrayal that does not arrive suddenly. It grows like fog. Slowly. Quietly. While you still believe you are safe. My name is Mariana. I am 37 years old. For most of my life, I believed my world was solid. Not perfect, but organized. I worked as the manager of a small family business, built by my grandfather, later passed down to my mother and my aunts. From an early age, I was trained to carry responsibility. While other children played outside, I sat at the table listening to adult conversations. While my cousins avoided obligations, I stayed. I always stayed. Maybe that is why they learned to see me as someone who endures. Someone who fixes things. Someone who never asks for care. My mother used to say I was born old. I smiled. I thought it was a compliment. I grew up believing my value came from holding everything together. From carrying the weight when others could not. My aunts were different. Each in her own way. There was affection, yes. But also comparison. Small competitions. Lingering looks. Comments disguised as jokes that stayed with me afterward. I told myself it was normal. Family is like that. I always did. When my mother became ill, it felt natural to take on even more responsibility. I practically ran the company alone. Decisions. Employees. Finances. My aunts agreed. At least in front of me. They said they trusted me. They said I was the balanced one. And I believed them. At first, everything worked. The business grew. Bills were paid. Problems decreased. And along with that, something began to change. Not clearly. Not directly. Small behaviors. Subtle absences. Meetings I wasn't told about. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room. I noticed. But I dismissed it. I have always been good at rationalizing discomfort. Am I overreacting? I asked myself. Am I imagining things? I repeated those questions like a mantra. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe paranoia. Maybe me. But the signs were there. Like furniture being moved a few inches every day. You don't notice immediately. You notice when you trip. And I was about to trip. Where is this coming from? I asked. She hesitated. She said she didn't know. But I did. I always did. In the days that followed, the whispers grew louder. Not to my face. Never directly. But I could feel them. In the way conversations stopped when I entered the room. In the way eyes shifted away from mine. In the way silence became thicker than words. I tried to speak. I tried to explain. But explanations no longer mattered. The decision had already begun to form. Not in documents. Not in meetings. But in the quiet agreement of glances exchanged behind my back. Betrayal is not always a knife. Sometimes it is a smile. Sometimes it is a suggestion. Sometimes it is the absence of defense when you need it most. My mother, weakened by illness, listened but did not speak. She did not defend me. And that silence hurt more than any accusation. I realized then that betrayal had already taken root. It was no longer subtle. It was no longer invisible. It was alive. Growing. And I was the soil. I kept asking myself, am I overreacting? Am I paranoid? Or am I finally seeing what has always been there? The answer came slowly. In the way my name disappeared from documents. In the way my decisions were undone. In the way my story was rewritten without me. Betrayal had become structure. And I was standing inside it. Betrayal does not always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it arrives dressed as concern. Sometimes it hides behind politeness. Sometimes it grows in silence, until silence itself becomes unbearable. In the weeks that followed, I began to notice changes. At first, they were small. Almost invisible. My aunts, who once praised my decisions, started to question them. Not directly. Not aggressively. Always wrapped in soft words. Always disguised as care. "Are you sure about these numbers, Mariana?" one of them asked, her tone calm, almost maternal. "Perhaps you should rest more. You've been carrying too much." Rest. That word echoed strangely inside me. I had never asked for rest. I had never shown exhaustion. Yet suddenly, rest was being offered as if it were a cure. A cure for something I had not confessed. At first, I explained. I always explained. Reports. Spreadsheets. Data. I laid everything out in front of them, believing that clarity would dissolve suspicion. But clarity did not dissolve anything. It only seemed to thicken the air. Meetings began to happen without me. Contracts were signed without my knowledge. Accesses were changed. Passwords I had used for years suddenly stopped working. When I asked why, the answers were vague. "It's better this way. We thought you needed time. We didn't want to bother you." I tried to rationalize. I always tried. Maybe they were protecting me. Maybe they were worried. Maybe I was imagining things. But deep inside, I knew. I always knew. One afternoon, my closest aunt asked to speak with me privately. She looked nervous. Her hands trembled slightly. She avoided my eyes. She said she needed to be honest. She said people had been talking. Strange things. That I was centralizing too much. That maybe I was benefiting from my position. When I heard that, my body went cold. Not shock. Something slower. Heavier. Like the air itself had turned against me. As I walked away, I remembered the same table years before. My mother laughing. My aunts smiling. My cousins running around. The sound of glasses clinking. The smell of food filling the air. That table had been a place of safety. A place of belonging. And now it had become a courtroom. A place where my worth was questioned. A place where silence was the verdict. I kept asking myself, when did it change? When did affection turn into suspicion? When did trust turn into doubt? The answers did not come. Only silence. Silence in the room. Silence in my mother's eyes. Silence in the way my aunts avoided mine. Betrayal is not always a scream. Sometimes it is the absence of words. Sometimes it is the refusal to defend. Sometimes it is the quiet agreement of those who choose not to stand beside you. That day, I understood that betrayal had already been decided. It was not about numbers. It was not about reports. It was about space. The space I occupied. The space they wanted back. And so, I left. Not with anger. Not with revenge. But with silence. The same silence they had given me. Betrayal has many faces. Sometimes it is loud. Sometimes it is violent. But the most devastating kind is silent. The final confrontation happened during a family meeting. All of us gathered around the same table I had known since childhood. The table where we celebrated birthdays. The table where we mourned losses. The table where we promised unity. That day, the air was heavy. My mother sat quietly, weakened by illness. My aunts looked at me with expressions I could not read. Calm. Composed. Almost rehearsed. One by one, they spoke. Their voices were soft, carefully measured. They said they had doubts about my conduct. They said I was confusing responsibility with power. They said I needed to learn how to share. Each sentence was polite. each word wrapped in concern. But beneath the politeness, I felt the blade. I waited. I waited for someone to say it didn't make sense. That the numbers were clear. That I had never taken anything that wasn't mine. But no one did. My mother listened. And did not defend me. That silence was louder than any accusation. I tried to speak. I explained. I showed reports. I reminded them of decisions we had made together. But explanations no longer mattered. The meeting was not to listen. It was to inform. When I finished speaking, there was silence. A long, heavy silence. Then someone suggested I step away from the company for a while. For everyone's good. To avoid conflict. I looked at my mother. She didn't look back. That was the moment something broke inside me. Not with shouting. Not with tears. But with emptiness. A strange emptiness that grew as I stood up. As I picked up my bag. As I walked out of that house. The silence followed me. It clung to my skin. It echoed in my steps. It became part of me. Betrayal had reached its climax. And it did not need violence. It did not need proof. It only needed silence. Silence in the phone that did not ring. Silence in the messages that did not arrive. Silence in the voices that did not call my name. I realized then that betrayal was not about words. It was about silence. The silence of those who choose not to stand beside you. The silence of those who choose to let you fall. And in that silence, I understood that I had been erased. Not with accusations. Not with violence. But with silence. Silence became the weapon. Silence became the verdict. Silence became the betrayal. And I carried it with me. Silence can be heavier than words. Silence can be sharper than accusations. Silence can be the final proof that betrayal has already happened. After the family meeting, I carried that silence with me. It was not just the silence of the room. It was the silence of my mother. The silence of the person who had always been my anchor. The silence of the one voice that could have defended me, but chose not to. I kept replaying the moment in my mind. Her eyes lowered. Her hands resting on the table. Her lips pressed together. No words. No defense. Just silence. And that silence spoke louder than anything else. It told me that the decision had already been made. It told me that my place had already been taken away. It told me that I was alone. I tried to convince myself otherwise. I tried to believe she was too weak to speak. Too tired. Too ill. But deep inside, I knew. Illness does not erase loyalty. Weakness does not erase love. Silence, in that moment, was not about health. It was about choice. I asked myself, why didn't she speak? Why didn't she defend me? Why didn't she say what she knew was true? The questions echoed inside me. They became louder than any voice. They became heavier than any accusation. I remembered other times. Times when she had defended me. Times when she had stood beside me. Times when her voice had been strong, even when her body was weak. And I realized that this time was different. This time, she had chosen silence. Silence is not neutral. Silence is agreement. Silence is complicity. Silence is betrayal. That realization broke something inside me. It was not anger. It was not rage. It was emptiness. A hollow space where trust used to live. I walked out of the house that day carrying that emptiness. It followed me into the street. It followed me into the night. It followed me into my own home. I sat alone, trying to understand. Trying to make sense of what had happened. But there was no sense. Only silence. And I realized that betrayal was not about money. It was not about power. It was about space. The space I occupied. The space they wanted back. Instead of growing, they chose to shrink me. Instead of sharing, they chose to erase me. I carried that realization with me. It became part of me. It became the lens through which I saw the world. Betrayal is not a single act. It is a process. A process of erasure. A process of rewriting. A process of silence. And I lived through it. I remember walking past the office one evening. The lights were on. The rooms were full. But my name was no longer there. My desk was empty. My chair was gone. My presence had been erased. I stood outside, watching through the glass. Watching the company I had carried, now moving without me. Watching the people I had trusted, now working against me. And I realized that betrayal had become structure. It was no longer about individuals. It was about the system. A system that had chosen to erase me. I carried that realization home. Into my room. Into my bed. Into my sleep. At night, I dreamed of voices. Voices repeating the lies. Voices rewriting my story. Voices erasing my name. And I woke up with the weight of betrayal pressing against my chest. Betrayal does not end in the moment it happens. It continues. It spreads. It rewrites. And I lived through it. Betrayal does not end in the moment it happens. It continues. It spreads. It rewrites. In the months that followed, I was erased. My name disappeared from documents. My decisions were undone. My story was rewritten. At first, I thought it was temporary. A pause. A misunderstanding. But then I began to see the changes. Contracts I had signed were altered. Reports I had prepared were discarded. Projects I had initiated were abandoned. And with each erasure, a new version of me was created. A version I did not recognize. A version described by others, whispered in corridors, repeated in conversations I was no longer part of. She was always controlling. She wanted everything for herself. She never cared about anyone else. These words reached me through others. Through employees who avoided my eyes. Through friends who hesitated before speaking. Through neighbors who repeated what they had heard. Hearing those words hurt more than I expected. Because part of me still wanted to believe it was a misunderstanding. But it wasn't. It was a choice. A collective choice. I walked through the city carrying that weight. I saw familiar faces avoiding mine. I heard whispers when I entered a room. I felt the absence of invitations. The absence of calls. The absence of care. Betrayal is not only the act itself. It is the echo that follows. It is the silence that grows. It is the rewriting of your story in the mouths of others. I tried to resist. I tried to remind myself of the truth. I tried to hold on to the facts. But facts do not matter when people choose to believe otherwise. I remembered the nights I stayed late at the office. The mornings I woke up early to solve problems. The sacrifices I made. The weight I carried. And now, all of that was erased. My value was rewritten. My identity was reshaped. My presence was reduced. And sometimes, the greatest strength is leaving quietly. And continuing to exist. Even when they tried to erase you. I did. I exist beyond their silence. I exist beyond their betrayal. I exist beyond their rewriting. And that existence is my victory. Betrayal did not destroy me. It transformed me. It forced me to see. It forced me to grow. And now, when I look back, I do not see only pain. I see survival. I see resilience. I see the woman who walked away from the table and chose to keep living. That is my story. Not the one they told. Not the one they whispered. Not the one they rewrote. Mine. And it ends not with silence, but with strength. Time does not erase betrayal, but time transforms it. In the years that followed, I carried the silence with me. At first, it was heavy. It pressed against my chest. It followed me into my sleep. It echoed in my dreams. But slowly, the silence changed. It became less of a weight and more of a mirror. A mirror that forced me to see myself. A mirror that forced me to ask questions I had avoided for years. Who am I without the company? Who am I without the family's approval? Who am I when the story they tell about me is not the story I lived? Those questions became my companions. They walked beside me. They sat with me at night. They whispered when the world was quiet. And I began to understand that betrayal was not about money. It was not about power. It was not even about trust. It was about space. The space I occupied. The space they wanted back. I had carried too much. I had endured too much. I had become too central. And instead of growing, they chose to shrink me. Instead of sharing, they chose to erase me. That realization hurt. But it also freed me. Because once I understood, I no longer needed their approval. I no longer needed their defense. I no longer needed their silence to break me. I began to rebuild. Not the company. Not the family. Myself. I rebuilt in small ways. In mornings when I woke up without the weight of their expectations. In nights when I allowed myself to rest. In conversations where I spoke without fear of being erased. I rebuilt by writing. By telling my story in my own words. By refusing to let their version be the only version. And slowly, I realized that betrayal had given me something unexpected. It had given me boundaries. It had given me clarity. It had given me the strength to walk away. Betrayal had tried to erase me. But in the process, it revealed me. Today, I understand that not every blood bond is a bond of care. Not every family is a place of safety. Not every silence is weakness. Sometimes, silence is choice.